welcome back. We are going to start talking about properties of the other quadrilaterals now that we have framed out the properties of parallelograms. So remember that a rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. And because it has 4 right angles and we have essentially straightened the parallelogram, we get a couple of new rules. The first is that if the parallelogram is a rectangle, then the diagonals are congruent. So not only do they bisect one another, but they are both the same length. So the converse is also true, that if the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then it is a rectangle. So let's lay out in a list all of the properties of rectangles so that we have them for easy reference. Okay, so we know that we have 4 right angles based on it being a rectangle. Based on it being a parallelogram, we know that the opposite sides are congruent. We know that the opposite sides are parallel. We know that the diagonals bisect one another. Running out of space. And we know that diagonals are congruent. Okay, so here we have all of the properties of a rectangle. And we need to keep that in order because the properties of rhombi and squares are different. So remember that a rhombus is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides, and that a square is both a rectangle and a rhombus. So, if the parallelogram is a rhombus, then we know that the diagonals are angle bisectors. So they're bisecting the angles where their endpoints are. The converse is also true. So if the diagonals of a parallelogram are angle bisectors, then it is a rhombus. The diagonals in rhombi are also perpendicular to one another. Couldn't be parallel to one another. So the converse is also true. If the diagonals of a parallelogram are perpendicular, then it is a rhombus. So now, just like with the rectangles, we are going to list all of the properties of a rhombus together and remind ourselves that if we combine the properties of a rhombus and the properties of a rectangle, then we have all of the properties of a square. So a square basically does everything. So the 6 properties of a rhombus, we know that all 4 sides are congruent. we know that opposite angles are congruent because a rhombus is a parallelogram. We know that opposite sides are parallel because a rhombus is a parallelogram. We know that diagonals are angle bisectors. Because it's a rhombus. We know that diagonals are perpendicular because it's of a rhombus. And then we also know that diagonals bisect one another because it's a parallelogram. All right, last up are trapezoids and kites, and these guys don't have as many properties because they're not parallelograms. So remember that a trapezoid is a quadrilateral with exactly one pair of parallel sides. And in isosceles trapezoids, the non-parallel sides are congruent. So we'll put our parallel markings on, and then we have a pretty little isosceles trapezoid. Because the sides are congruent, or the non-parallel sides are congruent, we know that angle A and angle B are called base angles, and angle C and angle D are base angles. If the quadrilateral is an isosceles trapezoid, then we know that the base angles are congruent. And we know that the diagonals are congruent. So these are the only two rules for trapezoids, and really they're specific to isosceles trapezoids, which is nice. And then we look at kites. So remember that kites have two pairs of consecutive sides that are congruent. So, oh my gosh, let me pause and erase that. All right, I attempted to draw it a little more straight. I guess my hands are a little shaky. Regardless, the consecutive sides are congruent. So we can put those marks on. And the nice thing about this is that then we know that the diagonals of a kite are perpendicular. As always, if you have any questions, let me know.